One thing I want to say, so I have a National Geographic article I thought was particularly interesting. How would humanity take finding if there was an alien? How would we take
Yeah.
it? So, and interestingly enough, the what they speak about is that they know we would probably take it pretty well because of all the false times that people have been told aliens are just
Yes.
just on
Yes.
Mars. Um,
I think I think they're making an excellent point there. I think a lot of people are already quite accustomed to the idea. I mentioned War of the Worlds in the last session, and so that was very much a they've come to kill us all, which was like obviously bad news. But that's almost 100 years ago now that book was written. Oh no, I think it's at least 100 years. And so yeah, we've had a long time to get used to the idea of hostile alien species, and I think we've also had quite a long time to get used to the idea that they might even want to peacefully coexist. So both of those possibilities have been around for a long time. But also, I would point out that we've also received signals from space in the past, which turned out to be stars, or in another case, it turned out to be the microwave that someone was like making their lunch, and like we're a few people were absolutely convinced that it was indisputably a signal of like machines existing. Basically, that was how they took it. Not so much intelligent life, but machines. And then it turned out to be a microwave that was interfering with their equipment, which is very very disappointing. But I think if we received a reply, or no, not even a reply, just a signal from an alien source, and it was undisputably an intelligent source coming from somewhere else, I think, if I'm honest, Jordan, I think a lot of people would just disbelieve it.
yeah,
And
and that's
yeah,
and that's that even the false news that life was on Mars, which was then found, oh, whoops, that's not life on Mars.
yeah, we jumped the gun there a bit with that one. Yeah,
But even the idea that like life was just around the corner, like merely a trip over to Mars, is
a
that
hop, skip, and a jump. Yeah,
most people ignored the news. Most people went,
yeah.
ugh. So
Well, I mean, they've got so many other things to think about, and it's not as though this kind of news. It might be big news if you're interested in this kind of thing, but it depends like what websites you're surfing like
yeah.
on a regular basis. It really depends like what your echo chamber is like bringing to you. I think a lot of people couldn't really care less like what's coming from astronomy.
So and it's so the so you've spoke of SETI, which is the one of the agencies connected to finding extraterrestrial life, but there's
Yeah.
also METI, which is messaging extraterrestrial intelligence,
Ah.
and they suggest that people would probably be similar either not caring or positive towards the idea of an intelligent
Absolutely.
life contacting us.
I
Um,
think absolutely. I think you would find that people were either apathetic or into it.
yeah, and so but there's something I want to. This is one of the perhaps more interesting aspects of perhaps the bias that perhaps me and you both have around this is that we both assume that NASA or a space agency that's perhaps aligned with say we're Australians or Australia's interests are the
Yeah.
people who make this contact. There's a really
Sure.
interesting
Mm.
argument or idea out there is what if it wasn't one of the superpowers that we deem as the right one? You
Oh,
know,
or even you go back to the Cold War, the Americans were convinced on a number of occasions that the Russians had made contact.
yeah.
And
So
when I say the Americans, I just mean that a handful of people in, one of the agencies was like, oh, maybe they've had contact and maybe that's where they got this technology from. Like people did entertain these ideas that contact could have happened, but it went into a black box somewhere on the other side of the planet. And of course, yes, it could be some relatively small program somewhere that you would never expect. That's right.
yeah, so a lot of the time, these statistics on like how people feel about aliens, how they, they're assuming that their government is the one who's made the contact, and their government has like signed the peace treaty that get all the information just for them. Um,
That's
but
right.
often not think about if you're an alien civilization, you probably wouldn't deem the ideas of borders or territories to be that crucial in I'm only going to give it to the. It would just be like, here's all the information, planet
Oh,
Earth.
Jordan, just imagine that we're like orbiting, uh, right now a distant planet around Sirius or something, and we're looking down on it from space, and it's from orbit, and it's clear that the planet is highly habited, and we're sort of examining its features with our high powered instruments from orbit. I I don't think, unless we had an anthropologist or a political scientist on board, I don't think people would be thinking all that much about political divisions within that planet. They would be just going, whoopee, we found a planet and everything on it is more or less one species and like more or less one political consciousness. And that's how science fiction tends to assume as well. You get the odd title where they're like, oh, we found an alien planet, but they're having disagreements amongst themselves, or there's actually different species that are both intelligent on this same planet. But by and large, we go, there's Martians and there's Venusians or whatever.
Yeah,
back in the day.
And one of the more funny things that I came across when researching this was, what if you're an alien species and you came across Earth and your measure of like success was like biomass or or size? Humans don't meet any of these things. And the idea that the reason cows are so connected with the idea of alien abductions or alien mutilations,
because
or whatever.
There's so many of them.
There's so many of them. If to a spaceship, cows seem very successful. They're everywhere.
Absolutely. And if you were biosampling planet Earth, there's a very good chance you would pick up a sheep or a cow. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. So we better get a flag and just wave it up. Us guys, give us the information.
Not the cows or sheep. And Jordan, you might also be familiar with the theory that aliens would conclude that the cars were in charge. And that the humans were the servants of the motor vehicles, and I do think there is a lot of truth in that idea.
I mean, I don't know how especially the idea of like humans' absolute non-observance of what we deem lesser life forms when we claim a forest or remove an ocean bed for shipping is that. Would we narrow down to a single species or a single kind of thing? Perhaps they would. It's a complex kind of thought of, if we got a signal back, would it even go to us? So,
that's right, absolutely. Would it go to our political faction? Would it go to a scientific? Well, I mean, I would argue at this point in history, Jordan, that the international scientific community is an international scientific community. I would argue that it is one of the most international aspects of all of human endeavor. That and shipping. So shipping and science are basically very, very, very international endeavors where most of the people that are in them think of themselves as participating in a global phenomenon, and they're not really thinking all that much about national interest. But, it doesn't. You've only got to step away from that for a minute to start getting back to sort of political divisions. But at least science has a relatively international view of things. So maybe we can hope that if an obscure observatory in let's say Chile, which apparently has some excellent observatories because it's got some relatively unlight polluted and electromagnetically unpolluted parts of the world. Maybe somewhere in Chile they pick it up and then they're happy to share it with us. But maybe they're like, stuff you, we're not sharing.
Yeah, and one of the things that in this thinking of, if we send a signal out, then we get a signal back. If you're intelligent enough to get a signal and send it back, you would try to pair the kind of signal you received to what you sent. And the places on Earth that are still using the technology that we would have been sending signals from 50, 60 years ago are probably not America's and China's and Russia's. They're probably less developed nations that have the equipment to even receive the signal.
Oh, I see. If they're responding on the same, band, so to speak. So can you explain something to me, Jordan? When the world switched, when parts of the world switched to digital television, it is still being broadcast terrestrially on from like a transmission tower, or how does it work?
I'm no transmissions engineer, but yes, it is. There's terrestrial and satellite sending of that information, but the satellites are directional satellites. They are mostly sending it towards the planet. So so they're not. It would be a huge waste of energy to beam it up into space. So most of them are aimed down directionally. But
whereas in the early days of television, it was just like.
Well, you would assume the early signals are ones that are terrestrial, that are microwave or radio, that would make it into space, just because they are, an Earth-based, tower is, but in a sense, aiming upwards because it's aiming in all directions on a curved planet. It is aiming towards a horizon which is up. So
yeah. Well, that's right. Every horizon points up ultimately. That's right. If you draw straight lines from the edge of a circle, that's right. So, but nonetheless, you're saying that, if they try to respond on the same sort of wavelengths that they received that radio signal in 1920, we may or may not receive it in return. Although my counter argument to that, Jordan, is that the world is still full of shortwave radio enthusiasts.
Yes. And that's one of the thoughts behind why some people are more into that, is because they're hoping to get, there's a huge community of people out there who are trying to contact the space station and talk to the space station, and perhaps they are the kind of people who would receive that old-fashioned signal back to us. So
yeah, exactly. It doesn't have to be like a hostile country. It could just be like a community of amateur radio operators who pick it up, who may or may not, know who to trust with the information. Yeah, it's an interesting thought.